She never spoke during recess. She just stared, and somehow she knew how many steps you'd take before you died. In the winter of 1873, beneath the frozen rooftops of Milwaukee's German Quarter, whispers echoed through beer halls and snow-covered porches about an 11-year-old girl who could predict death down to the minute. Her name was Emma Richter, and her abilities weren't mystical, they were mathematical. In a time when superstition clashed with early science, this haunting child genius memorized entire conversations, tracked human patterns with surgical precision, and wrote in a leather journal filled with numbers no one dared decode. Before spring arrived, 3 people would be dead, a town would descend into fear, and one chilling entry would expose a secret buried for decades. This is not folklore. This is a true historical mystery rooted in the silent corners of America's past, a story of a girl who used math to read the soul of a town. If you think you've heard every terrifying unsolved case, this one will leave you wondering how many quiet children are still watching, still counting. Welcome to the forgotten nightmare of 1873 Milwaukee. At exactly 2:14 p.m. she said he would die, and then he did. Not a warning, not a question, just a cold mathematical statement from the lips of a pale 11-year-old girl who almost never spoke at all. Her name was Emma Richter, and by the time the snow melted in Milwaukee's German Quarter, her name would be whispered in fear behind closed doors and in candlelit kitchens. This wasn't a ghost story. It was something worse, a true historical mystery that even science can't fully explain. It started with rumours, as most quiet horrors do. In the early months of 1873, with the Wisconsin winter pressing down like a coffin lid and coal smoke curling through the narrow alleys, strange talk began to rise from the cobblestone streets. The whispers didn't speak of murderers or demons, but of a schoolgirl who never laughed, never cried, and yet somehow seemed to know everything. Everything. The number of steps you took between your front door and the bakery, the exact second the church bell would ring, and eventually the precise moment you would die. Most thought it was nonsense, until one prediction came true, then another, and another. And by the time people realized it wasn't coincidence, it was already too late to unsee her eyes. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this wasn't the story of a girl haunted by visions. It was the story of a town being watched, measured and broken by someone who understood human behavior better than any adult ever would. And that someone had just begun to speak. She wasn't born during a storm, she was born during a crossing. 3 weeks too early, on a cramped wooden ship packed with immigrants fleeing Bavaria, Emma Richter entered the world between waves and prayers. The ship's doctor didn't believe she'd survive the night. She was too small, too silent. But she did. And from that moment forward, silence became her signature. As a toddler, she rarely cried. Instead, she sat for hours in corners, her eyes wide and fixed, as if she was studying the world, like a puzzle only she could solve. By the time she was 4, she could recite full conversations she'd overheard days earlier, matching tone, accent, and hesitation perfectly. Her parents, Clara and Matthias, dismissed it as mimicry at first. Then came the counting. She counted stitches in Clara's embroidery, the exact seconds between brewery whistles, and the number of birds that landed on their rooftop before snowfall. Not for fun, for pattern. She wasn't playing with the world, she was dissecting it. Neighbours noticed, too. Some said she was gifted. Others crossed themselves. But none of them realised that what Emma lacked in playfulness, she possessed tenfold in perception. She didn't miss anything. And once she learned numbers, Her world didn't just sharpen, it became dangerous. Because for Annalisa, everything, every heartbeat, every footstep, every lie had a measurable rhythm. And once she began tracking that rhythm, the line between prediction and inevitability began to disappear. If you stood outside their house on Galena Street long enough, you'd feel it too, that creeping sense that something inside was watching you, counting, you remembering everything. The Richter family's home wasn't different on the outside. A narrow, modest wood frame house, like the others in Milwaukee's German Quarter, it sat quietly between a tailor's shop and a bakery, where the scent of rye and coal often mixed in the frozen morning air. Clara Richter. The mother was known for her quiet kindness and diligent sewing work. Matthias, the father, brewed beer at the Kellner brewery and kept mostly to himself. To their neighbours, the Richters were a model immigrant family, respectful, hard-working, invisible. But Annalisa made them visible. Her presence unsettled people even when she said nothing, especially when she said nothing. It was the way she stared, from behind the frosted kitchen window, eyes tracking the mailman's gait, the timing of Mr. Brenner's tobacco breaks, or the way Mrs. Webber clutched her coat tighter when her husband worked nights. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, but she remembered everything. And slowly a fear began to form, not loud, not public, but dense and unspoken. The kind of fear that settles deep in a town's bones, where no one says her name too loudly, and children are told simply don't look at the Richter girl. Because even then, long before the deaths, the fires, or the scandal, people sensed what was coming. They just didn't know that she had already started recording them and calculating what would come next. The first time she predicted a death, it didn't sound like a warning, it sounded like math. He'll die at exactly 2:14 p.m. Annalisa said, without blinking, spooning porridge into her mouth as if she were reciting the day's weather. No panic, no emotion, just a fact. Her mother dropped the lunch tin. Her father went pale. The man she spoke of, Johann Dietrich, a known drinker, but hardly a danger to himself, collapsed later that afternoon in the brewery's malt room. Time of death, too. 14 p.m. From that moment forward, the town's whispers turned into fear. But no one could imagine that this was only the beginning, that her next prediction wouldn't involve a stranger. But a scandal no one was meant to witness. She didn't hesitate. She didn't guess. She simply looked up from her breakfast and said, Johann Dietrich will die at exactly 2:14 p.m. today. The room fell into a cold silence. Clara froze, tin lunchbox in hand. Matthias stopped mid-buttoning his coat. Outside, Milwaukee's winter pressed against the windows, but it was a different kind of chill that crept into the Richter kitchen that morning. Annalisa didn't smile, didn't blink. She just returned to her porridge. No one in the room spoke. Johann Dietrich was a brewery worker, rough around the edges, known for his drinking, but harmless. Clara scolded her gently, trying to mask her unease. That's a terrible thing to say, darling. Annalise didn't answer. Instead, she added quietly, He's been drinking from the brown bottle for 17 days. Yesterday he stumbled, his steps increased by 7.4%. That deviation alone indicates a 72-hour window for cardiac failure. The words didn't sound like a child's. They sounded like a report. That afternoon, Dietrich collapsed in the malt room. Time of death, 2:14 p.m. The coroner cited alcohol poisoning. But those who had heard the girl's voice that morning began to look at her differently. Not as a child, as something else. Something watching. Something calculating. And once the whispers began, they never stopped, because Annalisa had spoken once, and she would speak again. By the time word of Johann Dietrich's death reached the neighbourhood, it wasn't the coroner's report that spread. It was the time. People whispered not about the cause, but about the hour. 2:14 p.m. The exact minute the girl had spoken. At first some dismissed it as coincidence, but others remembered strange things, how Annalisa had once predicted a chimney collapse 3 days before it happened. How she'd told the butcher's wife her baby's fever would break at midnight, and it had. These weren't guesses. They were timestamps, patterns, numbers. But this was death, and it changed everything. Children avoided her at school. Mothers pulled them closer when they saw her walk past in that buttoned wool coat, her hands always still, her eyes always scanning. The head mistress, Frau Linden, called Clara in for a meeting. "She's too quiet," she said, "too precise. It unsettles the others." When asked why she said those things, Annalisa didn't apologize. She simply answered, "Because they're true." Her voice wasn't cruel, it was empty, measured, like she wasn't living in the world with the rest of them, but merely tracking it from the outside. And in that eerie detachment, reality itself began to crack. Because if a child could predict death with such accuracy, then maybe life wasn't as random as they'd hoped. Maybe someone, or something, was always watching the math behind our every move. 2 weeks after Johann Dietrich's death, Annalise made another statement, this time in front of the entire classroom. The students were reciting multiplication tables when she raised her hand, not to answer, but to announce Frau Linden's husband will not return from work today. The room fell silent. Chalk paused mid-air. The teacher's eyes narrowed, unsure whether to laugh or scold. "That's enough, Annalisa," she said sharply. But the girl didn't flinch. "His route changed yesterday," she continued. 3 blocks longer. No streetlights. He leaves at 5:17. Visibility will drop to 14 feet at 6:02. The carriage axle hasn't been inspected since last frost. She sat down calmly. The room stayed quiet for the rest of the day. That evening, Herr Linden's carriage was found overturned near the riverbank. The horse had panicked ice under the wheel. He'd struck his head. Died on impact. For the town, this was no longer an anomaly, it was a pattern. And worse, she didn't seem surprised. When told the news the next morning, Annalisa simply nodded. The probabilities were clear. What child spoke like that? What child saw like that? Parents began pulling their children from school. Some blamed the devil. Others blamed her parents. But Clara and Matthias had no answers. Only a daughter who observed the world as if it were a machine she understood better than anyone else. And if that was true, what else could she predict? Or worse, was she simply observing? Or was she causing? The deaths were disturbing, but the disappearances were worse. Because people expect death to make noise, sirens, screams, mourning. But when a person simply vanishes, no trace, no struggle, no reason, that's when paranoia spreads like frostbite. In the winter of 1874, Milwaukee lost 3 souls in 3 weeks, and Annalise had seen each one of them just before they were gone. But this time she didn't speak, not yet. Because what she'd uncovered wasn't just a string of bad luck, it was a system, a design. One that pointed not to coincidence, but to something hiding in plain sight. And what she would expose next wouldn't just break the town's illusion of safety, it would shatter it. It started with the cobbler's apprentice. 17 soft-spoken and always on time, he was last seen handing off a pair of boots to a police officer. Then nothing. No footprints, no belongings left behind. Just gone. A week later, it was Martha Grunewald, the butcher's wife, who never returned from her sister's down the block. Then the baker's son, 12 years old, riding home before sunset. Vanished. The town turned frantic. Posters went up. Wells were searched. Attics pried open. Nothing. And while others clutched rosaries or shouted for action, Annalisa sat silent, her notebooks growing thicker. She had tracked the precise timing of each disappearance, cross-referenced weather patterns, railway schedules, and candle burn rates. And she found something no one wanted to hear: a rhythm. Every disappearance occurred 144 hours apart. Exactly. But when she presented this finding at church, standing on a pew, voice clear, eyes steady, the pastor ordered her out. "This is God's will, not your arithmetic," he shouted, red-faced, trembling. People turned away. Her parents begged her to stop, but she couldn't, because if her math was correct, someone else would vanish in less than 27 hours. And still, no one listened. Not yet. The next disappearance hit closer, too close. It was the neighbour's girl, Elise, age 11. Same class as Annalisa. Same walk home. Same quiet face. But this time Annalise had tried to intervene. She showed her calculations to Frau Linden again. She'll vanish at 5:36 p.m. if she takes the north path. Tell her not to. Her voice cracked for the first time, but it didn't matter. The teacher didn't even look at the numbers. "This has to stop," she said. "You're scaring the others." At 5:38, the bells rang. Elisa's basket was found lying in the frost-covered alley behind the print shop. Still warm bread. No sign of the girl. And Annalisa broke. Not loudly, not with sobs, but with silence. She stopped going to school. Stopped eating. Her notebook grew messier, more frantic. The numbers no longer comforted her, they warned her. The pattern had shifted. The cycle was speeding up. Someone was accelerating it, which meant someone understood the math too. Someone else was watching, calculating, executing. She wasn't the only one following the system, but she might be the only one trying to stop it. And time was running out. It wasn't just the timing anymore, it was the geography. Annalise mapped each disappearance on the back wall of the attic using chalk and string. When connected, the pins formed a perfect spiral, mathematically impossible unless planned. At the center of that spiral, the Richter house. Her house. Panic didn't come all at once. It came in layers. First, Matthias found a dead crow nailed to their door. Its wings spread like warning flags. Then Clara's sewing needles went missing, only to be found arranged in strange geometric patterns beneath Annalise's pillow. The girl began sleepwalking, murmuring strings of numbers in languages she'd never studied. Latin, Aramaic, binary. Clara begged for help from the church. The priest wouldn't come. "That child isn't possessed," he whispered. "She's calculating." Outside, the neighbours started avoiding eye contact. Whispers returned. Rumours. Fear turned the town inward, and now even her parents kept their distance. Annalisa didn't cry. Instead, she erased the chalk spiral and started again. This time she added new variables, temperature drops, radio interference, missing animals, even the moon's position. And what the numbers told her next chilled her to the bone. The spiral was closing in. The next disappearance wouldn't be days away, it would be hours. And this time the target was her. It all led to one night, the night Milwaukee went silent. No carriages, no dogs barking, no wind, just stillness. Annalise had drawn the final line on the attic wall, and the spiral had no more room to turn. She knew what that meant. The pattern had reached its core. But this time she wasn't going to wait. Because if she didn't act now, the next variable erased wouldn't be a stranger. It would be her. and what she uncovered next beneath her own floorboards would make even numbers scream. Beneath the floorboards of her attic, buried under layers of dust and rotting linen, Annalisa found something that shouldn't exist: pages. Dozens of them. Not hers, not in her handwriting, but filled with the same equations, same predictive markings, same spiral maps dated years before she was even born. The ink had faded, but one name kept repeating in the margins: E. Richter, her grandmother. A woman who died peacefully in that very house, whose death certificate listed heart failure. But Annalisa knew better now, because the final page wasn't a calculation, it was a warning: when the spiral resets run. That night, her belief in logic shattered. She wasn't solving a puzzle. She was trapped in a loop, a cycle that her bloodline had failed to break for generations. And somewhere in that attic, just behind the wall, she heard scratching. Slow, rhythmic, almost like ticking. Her own numbers had led her here, and now they were counting her down. Annalise couldn't sleep, not after what she read. The spiral wasn't just geometry, it was ritual, a containment system, a pattern carved not by randomness, but by intention. Each disappearance wasn't an accident. They were offerings, sacrifices, to something ancient that lived beneath the Richter house. Her grandmother hadn't died of fear. She'd tried to stop it, and failed. Now the same variables were aligning again, same lunar phase, same temperature drop, same silence. The scratching behind the walls grew louder, more deliberate, and then it stopped. At exactly 3:33 a.m, the clocks in the house froze. No ticking, no hum, just dead still. Then the mirror on her wall cracked, not shattered, just one perfect curved fracture. A spiral. That's when Annalise saw it. Not a shadow, not a person, but a silhouette made of equations shifting like smoke etched into the room itself. It didn't walk, it pulsed. And with each pulse, the numbers she once trusted betrayed her. This wasn't science anymore. This was survival. Annalisa ran, but the house didn't let her. Every door she opened led to the same hallway. Every window showed the same moon frozen mid-sky. Time had collapsed inside the spiral. She screamed for her parents, but only silence answered, thick and choking like smoke. Then the whispers began, not from the walls, but from the numbers themselves, echoing in her mind. Equations recited like prayers. Coordinates to nowhere. Her own handwriting began to appear on the walls, in black ink spelling predictions she hadn't written. You will vanish at 4:44. Her hands trembled, her logic gone, her faith in math betrayed. The spiral wasn't a map, it was a trap, designed not just to contain something dark, but to pull its victims into it. Generations of girls. All brilliant, all silenced. And now she understood the final rule scrawled in red beneath the floor. The last to see the pattern becomes part of it. Her mind fractured, caught between solving and surrendering. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by minds that thought they could outcalculate the dark and failed. The attic shifted. Not physically, but perceptually. Walls stretched where they shouldn't. Corners twisted into impossible angles. The spiral had begun to collapse inward, turning space into thought, and thought into something other. Annalisa stumbled backward as the chalk lines she'd drawn for safety now glowed faintly red, bleeding from the floor like veins. In the centre stood a figure, not human, not even spectral. It was made entirely of formulas, fractals, and flickering memories. Her memories. It spoke in her voice, repeating her childhood thoughts, fears, doubts. You were never alone, it hissed. You were always part of me. She dropped her notebook, but the pages fluttered upward instead of down, swirling into the spiral like leaves caught in a storm. She reached for anything real, a chair, a floorboard, the doorknob, but they passed through her hands as if she was the one fading. The final truth cracked her mind. The spiral didn't take people. It rewrote them. Reprogrammed memory, identity, reality. She hadn't been solving the mystery. She was becoming it. And now she was the next equation etched into its endless loop. Annalise's scream never left her lips, because in that moment she no longer remembered how. Her voice had been taken, rewritten, like a line of corrupted code. Every memory she clung to her mother's lullabies the first time she solved an equation. Even the smell of rain on the windowsill was replaced with strings of numbers, looping endlessly. The spiral wasn't a design. It was a virus. It didn't haunt with chains or shadows, but with logic so perfect it crushed the soul. She saw flashes of the others' girls with eyes like hers, faces warped mid-thoughts, trapped in rooms that didn't exist. They weren't missing. They were still here, living variables, suspended in a proof that never ended. Annalise clawed at the wall, trying to write her name, but her hand no longer formed letters, only symbols. Her identity fractured into decimals. Time folded. At 4:45, the attic door opened on its own and closed. No one saw her leave. No one ever does. Because once you see the spiral's core, it sees you too, and it never lets go. What happened after Annalise vanished wasn't an ending. It was a contagion of silence. The town didn't mourn her. It forgot her. Teachers erased her name from rosters. Friends swore she never existed. Even her parents' memories began to rot, as if grief itself had been overwritten. That's what the spiral does. It doesn't just take people, it deletes them from reality. But what if it didn't stop there? What if the pattern never ended with the attic, the notebook, or even the town? What if it's still unfolding right now? Because in the final recorded entry found years later, one sentence remained scrawled. In fading ink, the spiral grows when you listen. And this was only the beginning. Weeks passed, but Hollow Creek never felt the same again. The air carried a static hum, like the town itself was trying to remember something it had been forced to forget. Annalise's house stood hollow windows, boarded yet somehow watching. Her room remained untouched, except for the spiral now burned into the wood beneath her bed. Birds stopped nesting on her street. Dogs whimpered and refused to enter the attic. Neighbours avoided eye contact, their memories frayed at the edges like scorched film. The few who dared to speak her name described an unbearable pressure behind their eyes, as if some invisible force was trying to rewrite them too. The school removed her from records, but one teacher, Mr. Halberd, kept dreaming of her always standing at the edge of a chalkboard filled with spirals, whispering formulas no one should know. He stopped teaching, then stopped speaking. One day he was simply gone. The spiral didn't vanish with Annalise. It lingered nested in minds pulsing beneath the surface like a dormant code waiting. Because the terrifying truth is, the pattern doesn't stop. It adapts. And once it's seen you, you're already part of the next equation. Some say the spiral was just a hallucination mass hysteria fed by teenage grief. But what hallucination etches itself into photographs that never existed before? What hysteria leaves voicemail recordings on dead cell phones always at 3:33 a.m. with nothing but static, and a faint voice whispering, "I remember you." Several students who once laughed off the notebook began to suffer blackouts, waking up in strange places, clutching drawings of the spiral they couldn't remember making. One girl carved it into her own skin during a sleepwalking episode. A boy tried to burn his textbooks, but found the pages were all blank except for the symbol multiplying like a virus. The town therapist, Dr. Eunice Bell, documented over a dozen cases of shared delusions, but then stopped showing up to work. Her office was later found ransacked, and her final note simply read, "It thinks through us. Now no one walks past the Carter house. Not after nightfall. Not after what the mirror caught in the reflection, a girl standing where no one should be, her eyes spiraling inward. Because what's left behind isn't just memory, it's contagion. The spiral didn't stop with the house. It began appearing in the town's cracks beneath peeling wallpaper, inside tree bark, burned faintly into the bottoms of frying pans. Children who had never met Annalisa suddenly spoke her name in their sleep. One 6-year-old traced the symbol on her fogged bathroom mirror, whispering, "She's still inside." The high school was shut down after the entire senior class submitted essays that ended with the exact same sentence, "There is no outside, only deeper." Experts blamed a prank, a computer virus, maybe a TikTok trend. But when news crews came to investigate the footage they took, blurred into spirals before reaching the editing room. A local pastor tried to bless the Carter home, but left mid-prayer sobbing, claiming he saw his dead sister standing behind the attic window. That night, he gouged out his own eyes with a spoon, saying only, "It can't draw what it can't see." Whatever this was, delusion, curse, or something that broke free from reason, it left the town of Milwaukee not with answers, but with echoes. Echoes that twist and pull and never truly end. Years later the house was gone, but the spiral wasn't. They demolished it in 2012 after 3 contractors vanished inside without a trace. The wrecking crew swore they heard whispers beneath the floorboards pleading in a child's voice, "Don't forget me." But even after the rubble was cleared, the lot refused to stay silent. Grass never grew there. Phones lost signal. Dogs howled and backed away. A real estate developer tried building condos, but every blueprint came back twisted hallways that led nowhere, rooms without doors, all shaped like spirals. One worker died from a fall that shouldn't have been fatal. His last words scrawled in blood on his clipboard, "It remembers." Local teenagers dared each other to spend the night on the cursed soil. Only one ever made it to sunrise, and he hasn't spoken a word since. A single phrase was found carved into the hood of his car. "You opened it." People tried forgetting, moving on, but memory in this town isn't linear, it loops. And every few years, like clockwork, someone new dreams of a spiral they've never seen. Until they do. They say the past dies when no one remembers, but what if memory itself is cursed? Decades after the last incident, survivors scattered across the country began receiving anonymous packages. Inside each box, a single photograph of the spiral staircase perfectly preserved, though the house no longer exists. Some found tiny scratches on their skin, shaped like curves, spiraling inward over time. One woman reportedly drew the spiral in her sleep over and over until she tore through the mattress. Another man, a former skeptic, went missing days after confessing to hearing the stairs creak at night. No stairs in his home, just silence. But his baby monitor kept turning on at 3:11 a.m, playing an old recording of a girl whispering, "You forgot me again." Psychologists called it mass hysteria. But in 2025, a TikTok creator live-streamed from the old lot and vanished mid-broadcast. The only thing left on his feed, a distorted frame of a smiling face at the base of a spiral made of roots. Authorities denied its existence, but the internet never forgets. especially when the algorithm keeps showing you something you swore you never searched. So maybe the house never existed, or maybe it still does, just not in a place you can find on any map. Maybe it lives in the spaces between memory and denial, between what we're willing to see and what we can't unsee once it finds us. Because if you've ever dreamt of stairs that go nowhere, if you've ever felt watched walking past your childhood hallway mirror at night, if you've ever heard the soft creak of wood when no one else was home, maybe the spiral has already chosen you. So the real question is, what did you forget, and what's still waiting at the bottom? If this story twisted your thoughts or chilled your spine, drop a comment below what part haunted you the most. Save this video so you can come back when the spiral calls again. And if you haven't already, subscribe now for more real stories that will mess with your memory long after the screen goes dark.